Welcome to the online debate dealing with the communist past's successes and failures over the last 30 years. My name is Łukasz Kamiński and I represent the organizers of this event, the History Center and Platform of European Memory and Conscience. Our debate will be conducted in English, but Polish translation is available on separate channel. I would like to start with introducing our distinguished panelists. Maria Axinte is a founder and director of the Pitești Prison Memorial and of the Manuscripts Publishing House. She's a graduate of the University of Arts in London, Wimbledon College of Art, and University of Bucharest. Dr. Jonila Godole is, among others, a journalist, writer, and translator, founder and director of the Institute of Democracy, Media and Culture, lecturer at University of Tirana, Deputy President of the Supervising Board of the Institute for the Study of Crimes and Consequences of Communism in Albania, graduate of University of Tirana and Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. Dr. Monika Kareniauskaitė is a historian, senior researcher in the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania. She is a member of Supervisory Board of the Platform of European Memory and Conscience. Graduate of Vilnius University, she also has been a research fellow at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland and last year at Yale University. As you can see, our guests come from various backgrounds and represent different processes, but all of them are involved in processing to terms with the past and internationally. We are glad to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Our debate will be divided into three rounds. I'm going to ask our speakers the same question in every round. Then we will have some time to answer questions or react to comments from our audience. So please ask your questions, put your comments in the Facebook comment section. We are going to discuss the problems of coming to terms with the past 30 years after the fall of communism, but without basic knowledge about the history, it is hard to understand the problems with the process we are experiencing. I would like now to ask our panelists to present the key events or phenomena crucial to understand specifics of respective country, because for example, in Poland, we are usually comparing our own experience under communism, and of course there were many similarities in our countries, but also every of this country was a little bit, or sometimes even to a bigger extent, different than others. So let's start with Albania. Jonila, our virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucas, and the organizer of this important debate dealing with the legacies of our countries. How many minutes do I have? How many time do I have?
7-8 minutes for the beginning.
For the
but if you need
7-8.
Yes,
so
one or two more.
I have to put it. Okay, so. Okay, sometimes I think in discussions like this, an outsider, the people who are just watching now, may have the impression as we are in a kind of competition who suffered more during the communist regime. This is not a competition. Who has more victims and repression among our countries, but still, as we are the first as today in this debate, as Albania, which I represent, is the first to speak, I couldn't resist giving some insight and numbers in this issue. I suppose the most of the participants don't know much about the communist Albania, but maybe you know that Joseph Stalin monument, first that Joseph Stalin died 1953. So this is something that maybe most of the people in the Eastern European countries know. And after his death in that time, all his monuments disappeared from the public spaces in Eastern Europe. But do you want to know what happened in Albania? Stalin statues remained in their places and continued to be guarded everywhere in the country. And it was only in December 1990 that he officially was removed from Tirana. So we had Stalin and Stalinism under the dictatorship of our dictator, Enver Hoxha. For the kind of repression that Albanians experienced in 45 years, it was a totalitarian Stalinistic regime using tools and the ideology as the cult of the individual, the class conflict, the political violence and persecution in a very systematic manner. In no other communist country, I think in Europe, could people be victims and became victims of political persecution in such a simple way and be detained for decades by only a very simple administrative act. The practice of persecution was directed not only against the individuals as the enemy of the people, as we know that in our countries, but against their entire families, and sometimes until the third generation. So more than 60,000 families have been banned in internment camps. 34,000 political persecuted have been imprisoned in that time. Thousands of people have died either in the camp or in the prison, and over 6,000 people have been shot and executed, and more of the half of them are still missing. So the country was turned during the decades during the communism into a large jail with 23 prisons, 48 labor camps. The political and economical elite has been exterminated and replaced by some loyalist party members in that time. The priests and the clerical, they were killed and imprisoned for the rest of their lives. The religion finally, as maybe somebody knows, banned in 1967. We are talking now about a population of 2.9 million people in the late of 80s in Albania. Then the Berlin Wall came and all the revolutions in the Eastern Europe. In Albania, the statue of our dictator Hoxha was forcibly demolished only in February 1991, so 2 years later after the revolution in the Eastern Europe. But all the elite of the communist regime remained. So it was, in the case of Albania, not really a revolution. I don't know how it was in Romania, in Lithuania, so we are going to hear it now. In Albania, it was a kind of negotiation of power from one regime to another. So George Orwell wrote in his book in the time 1984 that whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. And this is what happened in Albania after the fall of communism. We have continuously until now seen the control and the manipulation of historical records in the efforts of all governments in order to achieve their political goals in the back of the transitional justice, a kind of justice who never came, but we are going to talk about that later maybe. So we have not blocked yesterday functionaries from being part of the day politics. So just as we have not discredited yesterday's elite of intellectuals that served the dictatorial rulers and the regime without a mea culpa in these 30 years, they continued their mission without interruption until today. So that was in very brief what we can say about this very small country, Albania, with that kind of repression.
This overview of the history of communist Albania is, I think, for everyone who is hearing this story, very impressive, and it's a moving. I visited Albania a few times, and I met a lot of witnesses too, and it's still visible how deeply your country was affected by the communism. But I think we can find a similarity, for example, with Poland, what you said about this negotiated process of transformation from communism to democracy, and the problems which are with this connected in the process of dealing with the past. But of course, we'll return to this problem in the second round of questions. So now we are moving to Lithuania, also a very unique, specific experience. Lithuania was affected by communism for the first time already in the 1940s, so during the Second World War. So what makes the specific of history of your country so specific, Monika?
So hello everyone, and thank you again for the organizers for inviting me in this event. I'm very grateful to participate and to give my own overview and my own perspective on the case of Lithuania. So as Łukasz already mentioned, it seems that the main definition of the experience of Lithuania and the communism in Lithuania would be the occupation, meaning that Lithuania had not only the communist regime in Lithuania was not established by itself or its own communist, but it was a military aggression of the Soviet Union. So, and as Łukasz already mentioned, it happened first time in the 1940, then it lasted until 1941. Then for the 4 years, the Nazi Germany occupation lasted again until 1944. And then Soviets came back, reoccupied the territory of Lithuania, and until 1990, we had a Soviet regime. And Lithuania was a part of the Soviet Union. So the trauma and the experience of Lithuanian society was double. First of all, it was the lost freedom, the lost statehood. And the second of all, it was, of course, the communist repressions and so on. And also because these occupations were changing that fast and quick in history, in Lithuanian context, those two Nazi and Soviet repressions are seen a little bit in the same context. Not that they are somehow compared, which was the more cruel was the better one, or so on, but they are just seen in one context, one historical context. And this, both Soviet and Nazi repressions, they shape all the legislation and they shape our thinking, how our society actually deals with the communist past. Maybe another very specific case in Lithuania is that after the Second World War, it had a very strong anti-communist military resistance. And as now scholars think, this resistance was actually obstacle to really establish a fast process of Sovietization in Lithuania. It lasted until 1953, until the death of Stalin. But on the other hand, there are in historical memory more, not in the academic discussion, but in historical memory, some opinions that contradict with other opinions that because of that, Lithuania had more cruel Stalinist repressions, more deportations, which actually as historians have proved was not really the case, because a Stalinist regime was cruel anyway and repressed people without even resisting. So the main means of repressions under the Stalin were deportations and political trials, show trials, some show trials too, but not only, some of them were secret. And after the Stalin, another specific case of Lithuanian communist regime is that its surface seemed to become smoother, less cruel. Talking about the numbers, if under Stalin hundreds of thousands people were repressed, deported, imprisoned, then after the Stalin maybe we can calculate thousands. So the number is considerably lower. But on the other hand, we can say that the control of Soviet regime became way stronger because of the surveillance, because of the KGB, which managed really to control society in a really deep way. also somehow the majority of population stopped to resist and somehow started to accept the new communist reality as it was. So now there are debates, actually, was that a collaboration or just a way somehow to deal with these traumatizing experiences and this feeling that you really give up and have no way out, actually, and you have to adopt the communist reality. And also some people, I guess, they were broken psychologically and mentally, and even if the regime had a means to repress more, that was probably just not needed. And also, of course, economic control via the access to the resources. One more aspect traumatizing for Lithuanian society was the loss of the property, the loss of their real estate because of the communism, the nationalization process, collectivization process that was changing the whole landscape of the country for the rest of the 20th century. So, and also, the process, even after the deportations, people who came back from remote areas, Siberia in particular, from the gulags, they were facing the discrimination even in the late Soviet times. After the death of Stalin, could never really access welfare, could never access career possibilities and so on. So, and also another problem was that there was not way to deal with these traumatizing experiences, so people just kept silent. Another aspect, yes, like Jonila also mentioned, in Lithuania, process was interesting of restoration of independence and coming out of the communism. Well, there was always, even in the 60s, 70s, this unarmed or peaceful resistance, dissident movement, but only in the late 80s it got somewhat power, and it consisted of both communist and non-communist people were joined together in the process of perestroika and claimed for democratization and later claimed for the restoration of Lithuania's independence. Yeah, so was both, actually, was the anti-communist resistance, but also the change of a communist party itself. Communist party is split in two parts. One part stayed a member of the Soviet Union Communist Party, and another part of Lithuanian Communist Party left the Soviet Union Communist Party. So that which left supported Lithuanian independence later in the course of perestroika and transition period. So, and also another interesting phenomenon about Lithuania, that it was part of the Soviet Union, but its communist elite had big majority of Lithuanian people, meaning there were traits of national communism. So it's also difficult to distinguish sometimes who was the perpetrator or who was some communists, even in especially when they were communists after the death of Stalin, were claiming that even then we were kind of working for Lithuania, strengthening its national culture or economic wealth. So yeah, so these kind of contradictories exist until today. And maybe the last point I want to mention right now is that after the transition period and after the independence of Lithuania in the 1990s, there was another problem: whom to claim the compensation for the communist crimes, because Soviet Union ceased to exist very soon. So it's like Lithuanian state tried to compensate those things, but also there was a problem because Russia, first of all, went into the dialogue, and then, of course, under the Putin's regime, it's not possible to claim for some compensation, material, either at least moral compensation for the communist crimes. So, thank you.
under communism.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me into this debate. I would like to mention two representative moments in the history of communism in Romania that still affect the Romanian society and still divide the Romanian society today. So they mark the beginning and the end of the communist regime in Romania. So I would say the climax of the repression in Romania was the violent action known today as Pitești phenomenon or Pitești experiment. It was a gruesome action that took place in Pitești prison, somewhere in southern Romania, between November 1949 and the summer of 1951. But it spread to other penitentiaries as well from 1950 until the end of 1951. This basically consisted of continuous torture of the victims for weeks, even for months in some cases, extreme humiliation through a wide series of physical and psychological tortures. And the main goal was to obtain information. The secret police was looking to arrest as many anti-communists as it was possible. And it also led to their personalities being destroyed, so that they were unable to lead or oppose the regime later on. So only a handful of people from the secret police were known to know exactly about this violent action. So even the prison commander, at some point, he was forbidden to enter the cells of the prisoners or the area of the cells. This way, the secret police later on claimed that the students are the ones that led these violences and that they had no idea, or at least they weren't involved. They weren't the leaders of these violences. So at the end of this Pitești phenomenon, after 2 years, more than 600 students were arrested, and some of them, 22 of them, were accused of trying to compromise the regime, and 17 of them were executed in 1954. So this is one important moment in the communist history in Romania. Of course, the leaders of the secret police were never accused, they were never convicted. Some were even alive after 1989, after the fall of communism. And of course, they gave interviews and they said they only did what was right for the people. They were serving the people. So the downfall of communism is again a very dramatic event that is very particular to Romania. We've heard the different ways in which communism fell in Lithuania, in Albania, and in Poland as well. But while the rest of Eastern European countries saw a peaceful collapse of communism, in Romania it was bathed in blood. So more than 1,000 people died, more than 3,000 people were wounded, even after the communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu was removed from power and he was actually executed in a masquerade trial. The events in 1989 are still very much controversial in Romania. It is seen either as a revolution or a coup, a state coup, or a mixture, a hybrid of both. The power after the fall of communism was seized by a group of members of the former Communist Party, even though the population had asked for people to for the power to be taken by people who had no connection to the former regime. But in the 90s, people took to the streets to protest against this situation. But there have been violent clashes between the population and the power. And this further weakened the transition to democracy in Romania. And of course, those responsible for the crimes against humanity and abuses during communism regime stayed in power positions in Romania. They even took leadership of strategic institutions and companies after 1989. So this made the process of coming to terms with communism even more difficult. And it was a failure to condemn communism, to find the responsibles. And it seems that, like, even today, we are having issues with dealing with these past violences that have left a very deep mark on Romanian society.
Thank you very much. So we can see, even if you are speaking about the past, it is not possible not to mention the problems with dealing with it. So now we are moving to the second round of the questions. The question is directly connected with our main topic, with the process of coming to terms with the communist past. And even if, as we could hear, we are still not very much satisfied with the process, there were some crucial, important events in this way, some public debates. There were new institutions created after 1989 or 1991, depends on the country. There were some legal changes. So now I would like you to present your own opinion, your perspective on this process in your country. Please share with us not only the general story of the process, but also your personal experience. As far as I know, in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, some first debate, especially about the period of Stalinism, were started. Some first archival materials were available, but of course, the real coming to terms was possible only after Lithuania regained independence. So please tell us some facts about this process in Lithuania. Monika, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Łukasz. So first of all, maybe it's worth mentioning that in the late 80s, when this reform movement of Lithuania Sąjūdis was happening, which I mentioned already, the reform movement, kind of oppositional movement that destroyed the communism in Lithuania. There was this big movement also to come in terms with the communist past, in at least regaining the lost memory of the communist repressions. So some main newspapers or articles of Lithuania started to publish the memories of the deportees, their memoirs, their stories. So, for instance, the stories of the victims appeared even before the final fall of the communism in Lithuania, somehow in the public space. But that happened only in 1988. Since then, also before the independence, there were a very small public initiatives which grew into something more influential, but they kind of came from the society itself. So people, some professionals, some even non-professionals, sociologists, for instance, or people even not having any academic background, they started to collect data, collect information about the deported people. There were circulated some so-called surveys. So they registered family members of deported people even before the opening of the archives. Another thing is, what I think is really worth mentioning is the legislation which took place in Lithuania. So it actually started with the restitution process, the restitution of real estate, of the property in 1991. Then there were a couple of laws defining who is the victim of the occupation, of the Soviet and Nazi occupation, and some other laws of the compensation, material, financial aid, some state pensions were paid. So there used to be some legislation happening, and still these people have a special status in the society, some more access to social benefits. However, problems do exist, like probably everywhere else, and the biggest problem is how to take legal actions against the perpetrators, which was not going smoothly in Lithuania. And maybe only recent couple of years there was somewhat progress in that process. So I don't know, should I continue?
Yes, please, maybe you could tell us a few words about your Genocide Center, your activities, because it's
Yes.
A state institution, so I think it plays a very important role in the process.
Yes, so this institute was created, first of all, as I mentioned, more because of some civic initiatives of people who were working in the Institute of Sociology and Philosophy at that time. And they created some kind of research center to research the communist repressions there. And this institution was growing. Alongside with that, it happened when KGB moved out of the building, where was the KGB building in Lithuania, in Vilnius, Gediminas Street. There was a public debate in 1991, in the 90s, what to do with this building, and victim organizations of the political prisoners took the activity, and they started the idea that there should be a museum of the victims of communism, and they called it the Museum of Genocide Victims. With that term later on, there were another problems, but maybe I will not mention it right now. So the museum in 1997 was joined with that research center, which was made a separate, bigger organization, state-funded organization, and organization which is actually took care exceptionally by the Lithuanian state, funded by its budget, and it's specifically dedicated to research communist crimes, to help victims, and to deal with commemorations, museums, various events. So it's called the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania, the organization where I work right now. I work actually for the 10 years. And I can say that this process of researching and claiming justice for the victims of political repressions in Lithuania is more and more centralized under this institution. There are also the Presidential Commission, so-called Presidential Commission, funded in 1998 by President Adamkus. So this commission is also dealing with the research of communist and Nazi past. So there are like two bodies in Lithuania, plus all universities, academic bodies. But I would say that the Genocide and Resistance Research Lithuania is today the main voice of the victims, the main voice of historians, like represented these events. Yeah, it's publicly more and more known these days, and I think doing some important work. But unfortunately, itself, it's not a legal body, so it has a right to collect the archival material or research material for the prosecutor office, for instance, but itself, it cannot take the legal action. So it has some limitation in this legal aspect of the prosecution of people responsible or allegedly responsible for the crimes of political repressions of communism, Nazism, and so on. But what it does commemoration, it does education, history, research, museums, and so on.
So now see that we have a lot in common in the process. For example, the role played by the civic society, organized or even not organized at the beginning, so social actions, which I presume started process in probably all of our countries, I can compare it with Poland. In the 1990s, we had mainly the NGOs involved in the process of dealing with the past, and after years, under the pressure from especially the circles of victims, the former members of opposition, Institute of National Remembrance was created, and now, of course, is crucial for the process. But at least I believe that we shouldn't have only such powerful state institutions, but we still need various actors in coming to terms with the communist past. So now I would like to ask Maria how it was in Romania. You already started to draw us a little bit dark picture of the process, but if you could provide us some details and to share your personal experience, please.
Yes, so in Romania, there have been institutions and museums were created, but still the Romanian society knows too little about the realities of communism. And perhaps the most pressing issue in Romania at this time is that the subject of communism is absent from school books. So in the 30 years since the revolution, investigations into the violent aftermath have been opened and closed several times, so we still don't have a clear conclusion of who the responsibles are. So in 2006, a presidential commission report on the communist dictatorship was released, and the communist dictatorship was condemned. The contributors of the report even made some recommendations, but they weren't followed. So they recommended legal action against those responsible, opening of all the archives, for example. At the moment, only 2 former prison commanders were convicted for crimes against political prisoners. And they were imprisoned for a short time because they both died in prison in 2018. So it was a bit late. Their conviction came quite late. In 2016, Romania's Deputy General Prosecutor decided to reopen the case of the Romanian Revolution in 1989. So Iliescu, he was the president of Romania for 11 years after 1989. He was charged recently, and he is 90 years old. He was charged for crimes against humanity, accused of spreading misinformation about the existence of terrorists during the events in 1989. And according to this indictment, his statements had fueled terrorist psychosis. So everyone was fearing everyone. People started shooting at one another because of fear at the time. But he denied that he did anything wrong. He insisted that the terrorists were troops that were loyal to Ceausescu, and he said they were the ones responsible for shooting. 3 other men were part of the group that took power in 1989, and they also were convicted. They were also indicted on similar charges. Of course, no one seems to admit to their wrongdoings. But in terms of what happened to Romania, in terms of memory of museums, in the 90s, former political prisoners received the recognition of political prisoners for all the years that they were imprisoned during communism. And they created this association and started building monuments in sites where there used to be communist prisons and labor camps. In 1997, the memorial of the victims of communism and of the resistance in Sighet in northern Romania was open, but it was, of course, a private initiative. It was only later on financed, some part of it was financed by the state. Also, the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes in Romania was created. The archives of the former secret police were open. And in 2014, Pitești Prison Memorial, the museum that I worked for, and it's a private museum, was opened for visits in 2014. Recently, there are more initiatives to open more prisons, but the difficult thing is that most of these prisons are gone. So some of them are still functional as penitentiaries, but most of them are gone. So there is a need to quickly take action to preserve these sites. We have also commemoration days that were established in Romania. So we have the 9th of March. It's the day of the anti-communist political prisoners. We also have Heroes Day, 40 days after Orthodox Easter, and both Pitești Prison Memorial and Sighet Memorial commemorate these days, and we have a lot of events happening at the time. And recently, in 2011, the day of the 23rd of August and the 21st of December, these are two commemoration dates established by law in 2011, a commemoration for victims of communism and fascism in Romania. And in terms of failures, as the founder of a memorial museum, I would stress on the importance of education in order for people to truly understand communism. There is no real interest from the authorities in uncovering the realities of communism. We don't have a team of people working to do more research. We have very few specialists. We need more specialists in the field of communist history, education. It seems that we failed to bring to justice those people who actually committed crimes against humanity, and we failed to bring justice to those many victims of the communist regime in Romania.
I would like to say that for example, we can stress that, for example, in Poland, the process of this legal settlement of communist crimes probably is the most advanced ones, because we get a few hundred of verdicts against the communist perpetrators. But on the other hand, for example, you mentioned that you founded the museum in 2014, and the first attempts to turn the former prison into museum in Poland was not earlier than 2016. So in this field we are behind Romania. Now it's time for Albania, and as we heard, the communism in Albania was especially harsh, and those repression lasted till the very end. But does it mean that the process of coming to terms with communist past is especially difficult in Albania? Jonila, what is your opinion?
Yes. After listening now very carefully what Maria said, of course, I always thought we have a very similar past, our communist past with Romania, but then I see that at least some effort are done on the part of the government in Romania, in Lithuania, to bring some perpetrators to justice. Okay, in Romania there were 2 until now. It is a very little number. But in Albania, we don't have anyone until now. But so in the case of Albania, the process of what we called the transitional justice process didn't happen. So until now, there was an absence at the beginning of 90s of the legal of the trials against the functionaries of the time. Of course, they were some trials, but they were not indicted for crimes. So the persons that were not indicted for the crimes against humanity in that time, some trials they took place, as were in the case of the trials of former Politburo members, and they ended in some kind of indictments for abuse of funds and not for crimes against humanity. So it was a completely insulting process at the beginning of 90s for the real victims of the communist regime who expected justice. So until today, as I said, nobody is convicted for crimes against against humanity. So we can openly say that the Albanian political class, this is a problem in the last 30 years, has never had the political will to conceive and implement a policy of memory or establish memory culture which is victim-centered. So the victims, they were always a problem for every party and every government in Albania. So this chapter of the Albanian history, our communist past, therefore so much influences the present, because as we didn't have this kind of condemning officially the communist crimes, so now we have still tens of thousands of victims of the persecution, often in close proximity living to the perpetrators. So at the beginning of the transformation process and the first democratic parliamentary elections in 1992, there was a brief phase in which the demands of the formerly persecuted were at least heard in that time. So the compensation payments for the victims were neither consistent nor sufficient, but they were heard. Many of those were generally ignored then during the years for short-sighted party political considerations. So others had the experience over the years that compensation usually was organized as installment, and it was not executed until the very end. And until today, we can say that it is not closed, the compensation for the victims. So for the former persecuted in the prison, for the former political prisoners, and the others. So until now, it is not closed. This kind of process. So. But some good things or some good steps I can mention. So it was 2010, the first good news, the establishment of the Institute for Studying the Communist Crimes in that time, which until now has over 100 books published and studies. So it was the only institution in that time and until now which really has published so many books so that the Albanian people can experience the kind of repression that it was. It is not so much shown in the debates, in the television, in the public debate, so as we have seen now in Romania too. But so that was the first good thing. Of course, this institute, it was not like in Romania. It is focused only in studying, so studying the communist crimes, but they don't have any legal power so that they can put in charge or they can begin a process against somebody who committed crimes against humanity. So it was really an institution for studying. And the other thing which happened 2015, it was the establishment, or first the law of opening the Sigurimi files, so the secret police in that time, and it, as I know, Albania is the last country in Eastern Europe to be so late in this process of opening the files. So the law of 2015 does not really provide illustration, so but only recommendations for institutions that employ former state security officers, but still it was a very positive steps. A lot of people are critical about that. One part is because the most files were destroyed in the late 80s and until 1992, as there were the first elections, democratic elections in Albania. So it was really there are not so many files left there, but still it is very important to have the transparency, and we have to wait some years for making kind of balance at the end. But the efforts for a kind of transitional justice in Albania, I could say, also became more difficult due to the systematic dynamic how the bureaucracy of the communist rulers had been organized, with a strong hierarchy where every member party answered to a higher position, ending with the party leadership, everything was at its service, the army, the state security police, all the way to the neighborhood councils. So all the Albanian communists in the time even perfected the strategy of totalitarian dictatorships of turning a considerable part of the population into accomplices, or in German we say Mittäter. We have unofficially, we say that 1/3 of the population, or even more, they were working with the state security, with Sigurimi in that time. So that kind of pressure it was. And this dynamic makes it, in the case of Albania, very difficult to come to deal with the past and to come in terms with it. It is almost impossible sometimes, it seems, to distinguish those responsible from the soldiers who only did their job. So this is the kind of discussion that we have in Albania. So everybody was doing their job, and unfortunately, this kind of justification has been embraced by broad segments of the population and even by the intellectual elite. And I would like to illustrate it with a small example. So it was the debate in 2018 about our concentration camp, one of the first in Albania, in Tepelena in South Albania, where thousands of people, mostly women, children, and very old people, were isolated between 1945 and 1955. Because they were family members of the enemies of the state, so which were against the communist regime. Hundreds of children died of starvation and lack of hygienic conditions in that time. But then in this debate, in March 2018, the public opinion was confronted with two positions. So first, was Tepelena a place of crime? Or was it a kind of prison necessary for the enemies of the regime? And it is not very, very good to say that the second opinion, the second position was showed us how much this is embraced, this kind of just not knowing about the past, not wanting to know about the past, and just not wanting to learn maybe so much about the past. And it seems sometimes that the Albanian population, so the Albanian society, doesn't want to remember. Of course, it is still a very traumatized society, because repression, as I told you, in a lot of generations were very, very hard. But on the other side, as we are a very small country, so everybody had a little bit of responsibility, and so this is not so good to see that maybe you were responsible too, or you were just there and didn't act. Against the crimes and the things. So we can see that until now, the victims, they were never centered. So in our debates, public debates, and we have still this kind of class struggle in Albania. So the communists and the anti-communists of that time. So it is still going on. I don't know how it is in the other countries. And so that was really very evident in this debate about the internment camp of Tepelena, and some other efforts to manipulate the past or to reduce it. We see it in the commercialization of the communist symbols in Albania. You see it in one very, very problematic thing is that every day in the public television, the public broadcast, and in the other televisions, you have the propaganda films, the artistic movies, but still very propagandistic every day. And sometimes more than 4 films in the day, showing without any banner, without any discussion about the reality which they have. And they are very, very problematic. We are now with my institute, we have just published a study about this debate on these films. How are we going to show them today, 30 years after the communism? But when I hear Romania that they have a national day, they have monuments, I can say Albania is perhaps the only post-communist country without memorial to the victims of the dictatorship. without a day of remembrance for the victims and for the resistance. We don't have it. We don't have an official day. So we don't have memorials. We don't have the official day. And as you say, for Romania, the many places of remembrance, like the former prisons and labor and deporting camps that we have, are almost destroyed until now, and they are. But we don't have any museum until now in these places of memory. But we have, in the last years, we have 2 or 3 other museums, but some of them are in the places of memory, but not in these prisons. So this is really very missing in Albania, and what Maria said for Romania is really true. School curricula about the history of communism shows very little about the repression. They show something or a lot of things about the investments that the communist regime has done. They don't use the word communist regime, but during socialism we say. So please don't use dictatorship and communist regime. And this is we have organized in February this year, before the pandemic. We organized a huge conference, international conference, on dealing with the school curricula and history. And as we have seen in a survey with the teachers, we even have the teachers, even the young teachers, which they really don't know so much about the past. They don't know the days of resistance or this kind of commemoration days, because we don't have it. And a lot of generations are now growing up without any memory. And this is the work that we do as the Institute for Democracy, Media and Culture. We motivate the young people to engage in this discussion. We motivate them to be part of the competition as our Ask Your Grandparents competition, so that we can start and initiate a dialogue between the generations, so that something from the family can just be given to the other generations. Because the Albanian families in these 30 years, the Albanian society, of course, they have other struggles to deal with the reality after the 90s. But this issue is really very, very important for us, and it is very difficult because we don't have the political will, and I don't see it in the until now that somebody is going to come and maybe to change it. But still, let's hope.
Thank you very much. Again, a little bit dark picture of the current situation. Before we will start our third round, I would like to remind our viewers that there is a possibility to ask a question or to comment to the speakers. After the third round, we are open to answer your questions. So please put them on the comment section on Facebook. You can ask both in Polish and English. So we have already discussed the main issues of history of our countries under communism, the last 30 years of dealing with the communist past. Now it's time to think a little bit about the current situation, and maybe ask some questions about the future, because I think we all agree that the process is far from finished right now. Maybe one could expect it in 1989 or 1990 that after the 30 years all the problems will be solved, but unfortunately they are not. So I would like to ask you about your opinion about the current situation and what we can do more, especially what could we do more for the victims. What should we do to ensure remembrance of future generations? Because I think it's our task, it's our responsibility to secure the remembrance for the future generations, without witnesses. Yes, we all know how important are witnesses for our work, especially for education, but the time is coming without any living witnesses among us. So what should we do to secure this remembrance of the future generations in our countries, but maybe not only, also on the European level, because communism affected so big part of Europe that I think we should also think about some common actions of our institutions, our organizations. So let's start with Romania this time. So Maria, your opinion, please.
So, of course, it is very important, in my opinion, since we are a private museum, a private memorial museum, I feel like it is very important for the state authorities to get involved. They need to come together with us. They need to participate in our events. We have events all the time, every month, every 2 months, depending on the time of the year. And very rarely people from the local authorities have showed up. And for the first time last year, in December, we were marking 70 years since the beginning of Pitești phenomenon at Pitești Prison Memorial. For the first time, the Ministry of Culture came to attend and speak at our event, and we were just announced a few days before. So we did have ambassadors visiting years before. We had the ambassador of UK visiting us twice, but no one from the Romanian authorities and ministries came to see at least what the museum was about. There is this fear of the political background, or to be associated with political prisoners, because we look into the background, the social and political background of political prisoners, and no one does that, for example, with Holocaust victims. No one looks into Holocaust victims if they were communist, if they were liberal, if they were conservative. I think it is very important to remember that these people, the political prisoners, no matter of their political background, they suffered for years in the very severe conditions in communist prisons, at least in Romania, and not only. And so I think we need to overcome these fears that are really not funded, and try to look into having a more clear picture of communism in Romania. And we need a better collaboration between the state and NGOs or private organizations or museums. And so I believe a museum on communism should be a priority in Bucharest, in the capital of Romania, because we don't have such a museum. It's shameful that such a museum doesn't exist. It's shameful that there is no team that can lead this project. No one who comes to visit Bucharest, the tourists or even Romanian people, they can't find out about the communist legacy by going to a museum on communist history. But they do go to the People's Palace, which is a huge building built by the leader Nicolae Ceausescu. A lot of people died, a lot of houses and churches were demolished to make room for that monstrous building, and people go there to find out about the grandeur of communism in Romania. So this is very shameful that we don't have a place where people can study and learn about true communism, the realities of communist repression in Romania. Again, like you mentioned, Łukasz, there is a need for a European museum about communism dedicated to the victims and to the history of communism in Europe. It is very much necessary, particularly since many young people are oblivious to the history of the communist dictatorship. We see that statues of communist leaders of Marxism are erected in Europe, in countries that have known communism, like Germany. And it is appalling that such a thing is happening. It's clear that we still don't know anything about communism at a European level, at a world level. So furthermore, we need to do more research. There are still so many documents in the archives that are waiting to be researched, but there are not enough researchers, there's not enough interest. These people, for example, people in the Institute for Investigating Communist Crimes are paid with the lowest wages. No one is doing anything to motivate them. It's almost as if the interest is to just remove this institute from existence so that no one can speak about communism. They do support the idea of creating a museum of communism history in Bucharest, but still there is no action being done. We have a lot of private initiatives lately, but again, the local authorities and the central authorities need to support them more. For museums, for example, we need more museum specialists, especially for the communist era, because we do have museum specialists, but not for this particular historical moment. We need teachers to be trained on the subject of communist history and repression, particularly. We need national programs of education. The subject needs to be in the school books and in university. Otherwise, we are wasting precious time because, Łukasz, as you said, we have a lot of survivors still. I mean, for me, the fact that we have 100 or 1,000 people that can still talk about their experiences is very important, because this is how you learn about the past, by witnesses, not only by documents. So we need these people to speak, especially since documents of the secret police are can be fake. A lot of these investigators wrote a lot of lies and false testimonies in these official documents. So it's important to have both sides and to listen to the survivors while we have them here. We have a lot of events. We had an event a month ago. A survivor of the communist prisons came to speak publicly, and it's always a success because people really want to hear firsthand the experience of the gulags in Romania.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On the example of European memorial, we can see that those issues are hard also on European level, because European Parliament for the first time called for such an 11, and much has happened since then. Of course, our platform of European Memory Conscience conducted a competition for artists and architects, and we have winners of this competition, but without any further support on European level, it will be hard to spread this information, because I think this part of the history of Europe is universal. It's of course very much important for us to understand our past, but also our presence. But I think especially the values which were important for those who opposed communism are European values, and we should do a lot to secure the remembrance of repression, but also of opposition against communism. What is this?
I don't
Jonila,
yeah. Okay.
Please go on.
I didn't hear you. So, of course, Maria said everything, I think, what we would like to have in our countries now for the commemoration of the victims. In Albania, I just showed a little bit how the situation is, but we don't have any museum for our communist dictatorship, and we have a pyramid. So here in the center of Tirana, of the capital, and we were. It would be a very, very good idea to have it as a kind of museum of terror and repression of communism. But for my information, it's going to be a kind of center of technology. So I don't see it in the very short perspective that we are going to have a museum. But this is really a need, because as Maria said, they go in bloku, so here everywhere in Tirana, and they see only the remains of the communism, the buildings, and very few sites of memory so that we have here. So the memorials and the museums are very, very important. The education in the schools is for me the most important thing for the future generations, which they don't have any information, or if they have information, this is a kind of information which is coming mostly from the media, from the internet, or from the families, and it depends in what kind of families they are growing up, in nostalgic families or in very persecuted families. So they have a very distorted kind of panorama and perspective what happened during the dictatorship. So it is really very radical perspective what they sometimes have. So what I would say for the victims, it is we still have now, we think in Albania we don't have more than 2,000 former political prisoners. So most of them, they just left this world without giving their testimony and to the public, and we hope that their families can do something about that. But we are very engaged, a lot of institutions are engaged to collect their memories for the people who are still now, because we need them, because the problematic in countries like Albania, when you don't have a political will, when you don't have museums, when you don't have the memory sites, is that when you don't have the testimonies and the victims are dying, and you don't have the places of the sufferers. So then maybe one day a new generation is coming and they are going to ask us, what are you telling? What is this story? Because you don't have any museum, you don't have any people, you don't have nothing. So maybe it was kind of imagination of this kind of dictatorship that we have in Albania. So this is really very, very urgent that we have it. But in Albania, what we have seen until now, the process of dealing with the past has been mostly initiated by outside actors, international actors. Mainly in our country, it is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the OSCE or German Embassy, which have emphasized the importance of the remember. So it was not coming from below, from the society so much. Of course, they are the organizations of the former victims and the former persecuted and the prisoners. Of course, they are active, but if you don't have a political will, so it is difficult to help the actors of the civil society and the victims' organizations. So that was these international organizations, they have done pretty much for supporting us in this thing. And I will say that in case of Albania, as we were always so isolated for 45 years, really isolated, I think that our history of suffering and repression and all the consequences until today, why our democracy is so weak and problematic as we have it, I would always like, and I emphasize, is that it is still not only the Albanian history, it is part of the European history. And this is what I want to see, the Romanian history, the Albanian history, the Lithuanian, the Poland. So these are all part of the European history and should be treated as such, not as local history only. And so this is for me very important, the role of the platform of European memory. So I would like to be a little bit radical and to say that we have to condemn the communist crimes committed by our totalitarian regimes and communist regimes like other totalitarian regimes, first, and the second, can we have, or is it possible, maybe Łukasz can say something about this, but is it possible to have a European instrument of justice for the victims of our countries in which the justice system doesn't function so good in the like in the Western countries. So like a little bit like The Hague. So, but for the communist crimes, is it possible for the last perpetrators that we have among us that to have this kind of instrumental European or international instrument for justice? Yes, for the victims of the communist regime. So this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. And to answer your question, yes, it is possible, but it requires international agreement. And unfortunately, it is hard to believe that we will have such an agreement on international level because of two reasons. Unfortunately, communists are still quite powerful in some countries. They are sometimes even members of the ruling coalitions. But the second reason is that creating such tribunal would mean for our countries that we failed. And I'm not sure if every government would like to admit, yes, we failed in the process of punishing the crimes. But there is another way, which is probably much more possible to use. This is the universality of law. Because crimes against humanity can be punished in every country in the world which signed the convention, and almost every country did. And for example, the Netherlands in the last years punished some perpetrators from Afghanistan, from communist Afghanistan, and from communist Ethiopia. There was also a trial in United States against one of the criminals who emigrated later from Ethiopia, but he was deeply involved in the crimes under communists in this country. So I think it's just a problem of political will. In fact, in one country, we need one country in Europe which will be brave enough to start the process. And to do something with it, because maybe it's easier to punish perpetrators from Asia or Africa than from other European countries. But from the legal point of view, it's the same. It's the same problem, the same issue, the same procedure. So in fact, it is possible. What we should do is political pressure on governments. And we need one brave government, or depends, of course, on the legal system. Sometimes it's enough to have one brave prosecutor, like it was in case of Spain and attempts to punish General Pinochet. Yes, because it's another example of use international law in this way, using this basis of universality of law. So this is my answer to your question, and now I would like to ask Monika about her opinion about the current situation, especially the future, what we can do more.
Yes, so I believe that we should focus on 5 keywords: on memory, education, symbols, law, and academic knowledge. So about the memory, we already spoke a lot, about education too. I think what is good example, for instance, in my country, and as I know some other countries, we have prohibited both Nazist and communist symbols. So it's kind of example that would probably in the future could be followed by more countries and set in the European level. It's not easy, but well, maybe doable. Another thing I would like to talk about is law. So actually in Lithuania, there were many attempts already to use legal actions against people which were accused by doing communist crimes. So those trials were perhaps successful in the local level, in the Lithuanian level, in Lithuanian courts, they would succeed. But if that accused or convicted person would go to the European Court of Human Rights, those attempts would fail. But in recent years, there was some progress even here. Perhaps Lithuanian lawyers learned a little bit more how to really define crimes in a more convincing way, more legally convincing way. So last year, 2019, there was a successful case, a case called the Drėlingas against Lithuania. So this person was convicted by taking repressive actions against people who were involved in Lithuanian anti-communist resistance. And previous years, these kind of cases would fail in the European Court of Human Rights because his actions were defined as genocide. But this time, lawyers managed to prove that by taking actions, violent actions against Lithuanian armed resistance, actually, this could be treated as taking repressives against the nation or ethnic group of all Lithuanians, because resistance represented the important and representative part of Lithuanian nation, and they are well. So I believe in the future, with the really careful work of international law specialists, probably there is a way to reach more victories like that. Another thing is what actually scares me a little bit, the process which I observe in my own country, in some other societies, and in global level, is discrediting of academic knowledge, discrediting of facts. As historian Timothy Schneider said once, or many times even, that there is such a difference between democracy, democratic values, and fascist or communist values, that actually democracies are based on facts, on academic knowledge, on scientific knowledge, and what are based those dictatorships on myths. And what we can observe now, especially in a digital space, in internet, social medias, there are more and more campaigns, not really clear, or sometimes even clear where they come from, but these manipulations that actually saying that not only historians can write history, or that Western universities are somehow corrupted or leftist or whatever. Yes, there is part of true maybe in these claims, but on the other hand, I noticed the process that slowly these campaigns, or sometimes even conspiracy theories, are trying to manipulate people and reduce the trust into the academic knowledge, the trust in fact-based representations of reality, and replace that by some kind of myths, some kind of conspiracy theories. And I think that tendency is very dangerous, and especially the other danger connected to that is probably the development of very quick development and growth and evolution of digital technologies, of deep fake news, and so on. So right now it's so easy to fake some video or some document and to represent it as accurate historical document, which is actually fake document or video or photograph or whatever. So what I think is very, very important for the future in our work is to put as many as possible attempts to create those digital archives, digital collections of materials, museums, and so on, and really, really try in our societies and in European level to support the academic work, the historians. Yes, of course, there are debates. That's normal, that historians might have different opinions, but still not to let people from the outside of the academic field and not having enough of academic knowledge to kind of rewrite the narratives. Well, of course, it's good to have artist initiatives. That's great. That's great to have films, books, poetry, but at the same time to really educate the societies that academic knowledge really matters, and facts, archives, archive-based information, witnesses-based information is really valuable. Use as many sources as possible. So that's probably my point of today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your answers. And now we have still some time to discuss with our audience. We got some question, and I would like to start maybe the comment than a question. And I know who is the author of this comment, and I think it's important to introduce him. His name is Bolesław Czernewca. He was a solidarity activist here in Wrocław in the 1980s. Then he was forced to emigrate from the country, and his comment is like this: was there any dealing with the past? Because I didn't notice one. So I think we all have heard this many times from the victims, from people who suffered under communism, who has this feeling that nothing was done. Of course, we all are very critical, but we can agree that there were many attempts and some things are done. So how to answer such a question, which is of course very painful for those who are asking them? I don't know, maybe Jonila, maybe you could start.
So yes, as I told in my as I showed, there were some attempts to have a kind of compensations for the victims, and but until now all the installments are not closed. So most of the victims, maybe they have died without taking compensation for what this regime has done to them. And then we have these institutions since 2010 studying the communist crimes and the authority of opening the files, which they give an impact. It's not so big impact as we don't have the political will. So, but still there were some very positive attempts until now. And what we have then, we don't have any more dealing with the past. We have still in our political system, in the government and in the justice system and everywhere, we have very high functionaries of the old nomenclatura, from the old regime, so they are all there. We have them in the academia, in the very key positions in the civil society, in the institutions, in the education and academia, and everywhere, political institutions. You have mostly now since 2017, it was really very strange. In that time, it begins that you have in the key positions the old functionaries, the old elite. They are back. If not there, then we have then the family members of the old nomenclatura and the others. So it is really not very optimistic situation until now, but still very few positive steps have been done.
This is one of the reasons of those feelings when the former victim or former member of the opposition can see in television some former communists or even security service agents
in the parliament
as commentator.
They sit in the parliament in the highest positions. They sit everywhere. So this is very traumatic, as I told. It was traumatic in that time, and it is still post-traumatic and very difficult, not only for the prisoners or the former persecuted, but for their families, for the children and the young people that they have in family. They don't see any hope. As I told you, nobody was convicted, and these persecutors, these perpetrators, they live. In the last years, they are so active in the media. The former directors of the prisons in Albania, two of them, they just write in the newspapers and tell their version of our story, of the story of the past. And so it is really crazy. So, and we have a lot of books now written from people who are very close to the dictator or to the others, and they are very much discussed in the prime time, in the media and the television, and never are the books of the former persecuted people. We still try to have readings with them and to go in the schools, but it is only an effort of the civil society. It is not so much supported from the mainstream media and from the government and from the Ministry of Education. So in the last 4 or 5 years, it is much more worse as it was. Because before it was, I think they were not caring so much, but now I think they are caring too much so that we don't deal with our past. So it is a kind of systematic that I see as the socialists are in the power. So they are the former communists and they are not interested. I hope that a new generation of socialists in the politics would be more open, and I am very disappointed. I didn't find any open for my issues that I deal in the media and in our activities.
Thank you. Maria, would you like to add something to this question or comment, rather?
A lot of the victims, and I know a lot of the victims of communism repression in Romania, a lot of them talk about this failure in dealing with the past. And I think dealing with the past means healing. From a Christian perspective, at least, without asking for forgiveness, can there be any healing? So can you forgive the perpetrators if they don't even say they were wrong? No one says they were wrong. Everyone considers they did their job, and they only listen to orders from the higher ups. The higher ups say they only did good for the people. They served the people. So how can there be a healing? How can we deal with the past if there are very deep wounds that haven't been cleaned? We are having these infected wounds, which is the communist dictatorship that needs that we need to clean. Cleaning the wound is very painful for everyone, for the victims, and it's also very difficult for the perpetrators to admit that they were wrong. But we need to clean that wound. Of course, just like Jonila said, just like in Albania or other former communist countries, we can't really have the healing or the debate or forgive, because these people, the perpetrators, are still the ones writing our history today. So it's very difficult because we don't really let the victims speak. We don't really care about them. We gave them some financial compensation for the years of imprisonment. We call them to speak at our events, but we give them medals, or events like this have happened in Romania, but that's all we do. We don't really care about their suffering, about what they have to say, and it seems like we might repeat history if we don't learn from the past.
Please allow me to go to another one. It's a question asked by Guido Marti. How should we treat the negligence of the EU with regard to the memorial of the victims of communism and condemnation of the Soviet communist regimes? And what do you think about their approach? And maybe the second question from the same author. What can be done to change the perception of the USSR as liberator in Western Europe? So maybe I will start with the short comment that, of course, the situation on the European level is not very good, but it doesn't mean that there is the full negation of communist crimes. We have, for example, a few resolutions of the European Parliament which are referring to the issue. We have Pan-European Day of Remembrance of the victims of totalitarian system on 23rd of August. So a lot need to be done, but of course the situation is not good. So maybe I would like to ask Monika right now, especially this question regarding this view of Red Army as liberator, because our country in this part of Europe were affected, and we know Red Army, or remember Red Army as occupying force, but in fact for many other parts of Europe they are seen as one of the liberators of the Europe from Nazism. What to do?
Yes, this is true. So I don't know, especially what's weird to me that even Germany, which had been divided into East and West Germany, somehow didn't deal with that and still were able to make the communist monuments and communist symbols to come back to Western Germany. So even if one country cannot somehow find this understanding between two different parts of it, what could we then talk about a broad European perspective? But in this case, I think what is important not to let our perspective to be somehow neglected or forgotten into this broader European picture. And I do believe that European Union have tools to deal with these aspects. There are programs which involves different countries telling their own stories. For instance, my own organization, the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania, have done the project, European funded project together with Italy. And we presented the experience of gulags to Italian people in the universities. We had with the youth. And yes, of course, this history was very new to them, but this kind of collaboration really helped to increase the awareness. Another project I could mention, it was also a project of different European groups of young people discussing their own dictatorships and regimes, right wing, left wing, doesn't really matter. Like when somebody from Spain discussing Franco and somebody from, I don't know, Lithuania discussing who Stalin was, they come together and start at least to understand each other. So I do believe that we need more projects and more attention of the mass media in the European level, and all our responsibility of all our organization is, of course, sometimes it's easier, and each country have a lot of problems in their own local perspective, one country perspective, and even one country regional perspective, but also not to forget that we're all responsible to spread the information in different languages, to try to participate in mass media debates and push that story, that what I could call not only our story, but actually historically accurate version of what happened in our countries. So yeah, I believe in education and, well, work with international public sphere. I think it's crucial in this point.
Thank you very much. I think this aspect of comparing experiences is also very, very important. You mentioned. If you don't mind, I will skip now to the next question. Of course, when answering the third question, we can also return to this one about what to do with education on European level. And the question is asked by Daniela Dandes. And the question is about an argument used especially by the younger generation with communist sympathies, that no country, not even the USSR, actually implemented a true version of communism. They just pushed some parts of communism, therefore real communists never had a chance. And that is why people had a bad experience with it. What would you say to such people? So this is an important question, because we know among younger in Europe, but not only, also in even in United States, there is a high level of idea of trying again and introducing some new form of communism or Marxism to solve current problems. So what is your opinion? I don't know who would like to start to answer this.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, so I think the problem is that people don't go to research the original sources, because if you look at the Lenin's writings and to his point of view, there is a lot about tyranny, about repression, about annihilations of the classes by the violent way. So it means that its very roots, communism was not such a peaceful ideology. And I think the problem is that people have some kind of very idealized version, but don't really study the real sources, the real thinking of the communist leaders. That's probably one aspect of this problem. And also the Cold War, which was a long years of the brainwashing by the Soviet Union, it did its work. I'm not surprised with that.
Thank you very much for your perspective. Jonila, would you like to add something to this?
In Albania,
Yes,
I have seen that. I have seen that in Albania too. In the last years, that a lot of young people, students mostly of human science, so philosophy and sociology and some other sciences, the direction that they said it was not the fault of communism, of Marxism. So it is like a mantra, Marxism. It is not the fault of them, it is the fault of Enver Hoxha, of Stalin, of Lenin, and these people. And we always say, but you see, in all these countries who just tried to implement Marxism and communism, we see in what ended. And more than 100 million of victims and blood, and the corruption, and a kind of economy that was really collapsed at the end of 80s, or in Albania even in the 70s. So as we have the isolation from all the other world. So this is something which is really very problematic, and how to deal with this problem is, as Monika said, so we need to talk more about that. What disturbs me is that I find it in my way to Germany or to other Western countries. The problem is that then you have these young students and even some other peoples which are not so young, and they are still very left in that thing that they always say that that communism is not so bad and socialism is not so bad, what you had there. But I think they haven't lived in our countries. I would have liked to change the places, and I would like to change the places now. If somebody from the Western, a communist or a Marxist and a socialist, can come and live in Albania and see what the consequences of all this criminal regime we have here, and we had it for 45 years, and we have now 30 years after, and still it's the same. So we can say that we have 75 years of communism and the consequences of that. And in Albania, at least, we are going to have some more decades about that. So I think the problem is in the university. In the university is the problem that it is very easy and very nice for the young people to be how can I say, to be open for the people who are suffering, or for the groups who are suffering and who live in not so good conditions, just to think that it was better in communism because everybody was the same. And they forget that it was not the same, because it seems like it was the same, but in the middle of the night, in the day, in every hour, in 24 hours, in every minute, the state, the secret police could come to you and take your life away, or your property. Of course, they have taken that until the 50s, and then the religion and everything. So you have the facts, but Monika is right. They don't read the facts. It is, as always they say, the facts is the fake news. It's easy. It's easy to believe to fake news, and it's easy to believe to lies sometimes, and not to painful truth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maria, would you like to add anything to this point?
I agree with Monika and Jonila, and I think it's a very appealing ideology if you don't go deeper into it. And let's not forget that hatred is a very important part of this Marxist, socialist, communist idea. So anything that is built on hatred I'm not sure anyone can argue it can work. Second of all, I would say that after 100 years that we had tried to create the perfect communist country or society, we have failed so much. So many people have died and have been repressed. And I would question, is there a need for more people to die for us to realize that it was wrong and it's a wrong idea and we should move on and look for something better, not go back to the past and try to put to test something that has proved to be criminal and that has failed. And just one last comment that I was seeing in the last days on Facebook, this comment that I think it's a very good answer to this question. You can be a communist in a free country, but you should try to be free in a communist country. And I think that says it all.
Yes, thank you very much. We still have 2 questions, but I'm afraid that we are running out of the time and we need to come to the end of our debate. The first question by Gentia and Dedia is about the education. I think we discussed it, especially on the example of Albania and Romania. My short answer, because the question is how is the situation in the other countries, my short comment would be that usually better. I'm sorry to say it to our colleagues from Albania and Romania, but usually the situation is better. But for example, in the Czech Republic, colleagues of mine are still not very much satisfied with the situation. And the last question is about the example of fake news, which did much harm to historical perception of the audience, and this question is addressed directly to Monika. So, could you give us such an example?
Sorry.
It's an example of fake news which did much harm to historical perception of the audience. I think we can use, for example, the last article by President Putin, who, for example, promoted in this text the version that Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia in the 1940 joined the Soviet Union because of the will of the people. Yes, so I think it's an answer to this question. So maybe the very last question from Mikołaj Sołkiewicz. The situation all of you describe is very pessimistic, but on the other hand, which transitional justice system of the former Eastern Bloc country do you most appreciate? So where the situation is in the best from your perspective? So maybe we could go in alphabetic order of our countries. Jonila,
so
from your perspective.
I would say we had for the illustration, for the law on opening the Sigurimi files, we have as a model, or the government has as a model had the German law, of course without any illustration, and that was not so good because the Eastern Germany. They have communism, of course, but it was not the same as we have in Albania, this kind of repression and everything else. So that was not so good, this experience, but still in dealing with the past, in the education and in projects and every other things, I would say that the Eastern Germany, so how Germans deal with their past, with Nazism and the communism, it is really very good for us, and we are very much oriented on that. And I think that Poland, for me, it is maybe one of the best examples how it worked, and the Czech Republic in some of the things of dealing with the files, so with the secret police files. So, and I would like Romania, as I said, it is the country which has the most similarities with Albania, as we know and the historians say. So, but still we don't have so much connections, and we don't know so much how Romania dealt about that, because we are always, like I think in Romania too, always always just have the perspective always is the Western European. So everything what comes from the Western is better, and this is for me not so good, because the realities are very, very different. And I would have liked to have more experience and to have the experience of Romania, which is, as I say, very, very, very similar. But anyhow, so these are the countries that we know. We don't have any contacts with the Baltic countries, with Lithuania, with even with Bulgaria, not so much, and with other countries. We are very isolated in the work that we do, and so it is very easy for the political class to find the best, as we don't have information, the society don't have any information at all, to find the best solution, to take the best law, which is without lustration, without anything else. So the best thing that fits to their interests. This is coming from not knowing how the other countries deal with the past, or were dealing and are dealing with the past.
Thank you very much. Monika, your perspective, which country did the best?
So I would agree with the examples already mentioned, Poland, Eastern Germany or Germany, other countries, but I also would say that I'm not so much pessimistic about the Baltic countries too. Because yes, with pushing the law is difficult here, pushing the persecution, legal actions against the perpetrators. But on the other hand, all three Baltic countries really have the museums to commemorate the communist past. They do have good research, high academic quality research, publishing books, education, commemoration ceremonies, many public initiatives how to commemorate victims, especially to honor those victims. So, and I even think that, for instance, in Lithuania, what is really important that we have a psychological community of psychologists involved into the process, helping to deal with the communism as a trauma for individuals and for the whole society. So I don't see the situation as like really so much pessimistic. And I think somewhat work has been done in a good direction. And I also think that at least in Lithuania, this question or comment, which we heard previously from the Polish perspective, if I'm not wrong, that nothing has been done to deal with the past, it would be very rare that it could be heard in the context of Lithuania, because even victims, they feel they are heard, at least they are accepted. Their voice is heard in public. They are not like totally neglected in the public. There are ceremonies and commemorations even in Lithuanian parliament. And yes, nothing was done perfect. There were mistakes. Communist leaders were not like really put into the legal actions or so on. So there were problems, but at the same time, I see also positive side, and I see it especially from young generation. We have various projects. One of them is called, for instance, Mission Siberia, which is very extremely popular. And many people participate in those projects and try to build that. Young people from schools or universities participate and try to build that memory or contribute to the memory. So I do think I would mention not only these pessimistic sides, but also with focus that it's actually a big work done all over Europe in many, many countries, and I believe we can still progress.
Thank you very much. Maria, your answer to this question.
I don't have such a broad experience. I visited some countries in Europe, and I visited some museums, and I know that the Baltic countries are doing quite a lot in terms of dealing with the past, education, museums. But since knowledge is power, I think it's very important to have these museums, and I think Germany indeed is doing a very good job at transforming these sites of repression into museums. They do research a lot. They have teams that deal with this subject. And I think it's a very good model of best practices that we can all learn from. If you go to Berlin, you can see so many museums, the Museum of Former Secret Police, the museums in former prisons, They deal very good with the memory, and they let people know about the subject. People have access to a lot of information, and I think if there are museums, if there are teams of researchers that deal with the subject, it's great. We can be optimistic and say that we are going the right direction.
Thank you very much. I see that there are new comments coming, but unfortunately we need to finish right now. So I would like to ask our panelists to read the comments on Facebook and maybe answer them this way. So our debate is coming to an end. I would like to warmly thank our great experts for sharing their knowledge and experience with us. I learned a lot, and I am sure that also our viewers learned a lot thanks to you. I thank translators for their efforts and all our audience for being with us. Thank you, and please follow the next events at the Remembrance and Future Forum. All of them will be announced on Depot History Center website and Facebook. Thank you very much, and goodbye.